Welcome, and thank you for joining us for Princeton Brain, Spine, and Sport Medicine's first live webinar. Tonight, we have people viewing from Zoom, Facebook Live, and YouTube. This evening, we'll be hearing from neurosurgeon and founder of Princeton Brain, Spine, and Sports Medicine, Dr. Mark McLaughlin, who will be sharing how we can live healthier, more fulfilling lives. Before we hand things over to Dr. McLaughlin, I just have a couple housekeeping items to review. We've placed everyone on mute, but we do encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. For Zoom users, you can use the chat function in the bottom of your Zoom window. For those on Facebook Live, please use the comment section, and the same for those of you who are viewing on YouTube. We have people monitoring all of these venues, and we'll be answering as many of your questions as we can at the end of the evening. Now, I'd like to take an opportunity to introduce Dr. McLaughlin. He is a practicing neurosurgeon, an author, and founder of Princeton Brain, Spine, and Sports Medicine. He recently published a book titled Cognitive Dominance, A Brain Surgeon's Quest to Outthink Fear. This is available on Amazon. He is also a national and international speaker. In his spare time, Dr. McLaughlin coaches youth wrestling in Trenton and Princeton, New Jersey. Please join me in welcoming Dr. McLaughlin.
Thank you, Gwen. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to share my screen with you. The title of this talk was inspired by the movie Limitless, starring Bradley Cooper. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's a story about Eddie Moreau, who's a struggling writer facing unemployment and rejection from his girlfriend. And he realizes at the turning point of the movie that he has no future. It all changes when he tries an untested drug called NZT, and he immediately experiences enhanced mental acuity. He puts his life into overdrive, penning his first novel in one night, rising to the top of Wall Street over several months, and then ultimately winning his girlfriend back. It's an amazing story. Is it possible? Alchemists for 1,000 years have looked for the substance of life, the elixir of life, the philosopher's stone, the compound they've all searched for was something that would convey knowledge and wealth and health and longevity. I'm here tonight to tell you that something like that actually exists, and we can touch upon it tonight. In the next 47 minutes, if you stick around, I'll let you have a taste of it. And the beauty of it is that you can take it home and share it with your family and your friends. So let's get started. Oh, my slide's not advancing. Hang on 1 second. There we go. Bill and Sandy were rushing out the door of their house one early morning in February. They had booked a flight to Hawaii to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary, and they were late. As Bob lugged the overstuffed suitcase to the door, the sole of his new shoe caught the edge of Sandy's handbag, sending him tumbling down 7 steps. Instead of the taxi taking them to the airport, the ambulance took them to the hospital. In the emergency room, he was diagnosed with a hip fracture and a subdural hematoma. No trip, no celebration, no anniversary. Did you know that falls are one of the #1 causes of loss of independence in people our age? It's an important and useful fact, and just one of the many I'll share with you tonight. We'll get back to Bill's situation and the final exam a little later. Oh, they didn't tell you there was going to be a final exam? Well, I know I have a lot of students on tonight, so I'm sorry, everybody's going to have a final exam. But first, let's get a show of hands. How many of you have more than one life? Anybody? I don't think so, right? I'm here tonight to tell you that hoping you will live a long and healthy life is not a plan. And as one of my great teachers has taught me in the past, having good intentions is not the same as being intentional. And if you want to live a long and happy and limitless life, you have to live intentionally. So here's the scoop. I'm going to speak to you from my perspective as a brain surgeon. I'm going to let you look into the window of my world and see my personal life and professional life as someone who enjoys deep dives into heavy reading and has many experiences taking care of thousands of patients and seeing tragedies unfold in their lives that are preventable and avoidable. It's my hope that by sharing these experiences and the key books I've read and my thoughts and reflections, that perhaps you can form a new framework, a new way of living that will lead you to a limitless life. You see, it's not really a pill that you need to take. It's a methodology and a mindset. So how does one start living a limitless life? To me, it's a threefold process by which you need to create new habits, care for your back and brain, and curate your mind. So first, let's talk about creating new habits. In order to understand how habits work, it's important to understand the anatomy of a habit. So the first quote of the night I'd like you to remember is, first we make our habits, and then our habits make us. The first time I read that quote is from a book by Charles Duhigg, The Power of Habit. This is an outstanding book, and it goes into a deep dive about the anatomy of habits. You see, once we know how habits, what the architecture of a habit is, we can redesign it to serve our life and serve our purpose in life. So let's take a look at it. It turns out that probably 40% of the actions you perform every day are not thought evoked. You are not making a decision about them. They're an ingrained habit in your brain. And it's because your brain is constantly trying to conserve energy. So we have to be careful about that. If you're instilling good habits and following good habits, that's great. But as you know, we all have bad habits that we need to work on too. So a habit is simply the creation of a cue, routine, and reward. If you understand that loop, you can control it. So let's say you're feeling anxiety about an upcoming situation at work, or one of your kids is sick. You may have a routine to say, oh, I got to throw on my running shoes and my shorts and shirt and go for a run because I know that's going to relax me. And you throw on your shirt and short and shoes and you run outside for an hour, and then you get that reward of that relaxation, that little adrenaline and oxytocin and dopamine release in your brain, and you feel better. Well, that's great. That's a good habit. But what happens if you feel that anxiety and you don't turn to a run, but you turn to Chick-fil-A, or you turn to a cigarette or a glass of alcohol? Then that same routine will give you a reward. There is a good feeling related to that activity, and that will be a setup for future bad habits and that same loop recurring over and over again. So if you can look at cues, which are almost always the same, they're the experience that you have, and when you feel that craving to do the routine for the reward, you need to ask yourself, what is that routine? And is that routine serving me or undermining me? And if you can instill a new routine where you're experiencing that cue, you can experience the reward and you can turn bad habits into good. It's as simple as that. So I'd like to instill a new habit in you tonight, a habit of looking around your house and your home, and looking around your families and your loved ones' houses and homes, and trying to find avoidable hazards. Anything that can trip you up by the stairs, any shoes that you've put to set down and bring down the stairs, anytime you don't touch the banister when you're going down the stairs, anytime the stairs aren't properly lighted, those are all instances where you can take a quick spill. And I can tell you, I hear it in the emergency room all the time, just like I heard from Bill. It was just a quick moment. It was a little tiny turn and a twist in a bag that wasn't normally at the top of the steps, that was getting ready. They were getting ready to go to Hawaii. And he caught his foot on that bag. You've got to look at the stairs as a hazardous place, and a place that needs to be kept clean of all debris, an important place where you need to hold the banister whenever you're going down it. What about shoes? I can tell you, these flip-flops are a common cause of visits to the emergency room. Sure, I love wearing flip-flops in the summer too, particularly when I'm at the beach, but don't walk with them up and down stairs. Take them off, walk with your bare feet. There's no traction on these shoes. They often will slip out under you. You can land on your bottom and fracture your tailbone, or you can fall forward and strike your head. So another active habit you could form is to be consciously aware of ordinary shoes that could help you and not cause falls. And you can actually shop with your loved ones to get better shoes, people who might be at risk for falling. Lastly, there's a whole bunch of other hazards that you can see if you're looking and your mind is aware. Throw rugs in houses are very dangerous. Step stools in any person who's elderly in their house need to be removed. And you need to train yourself or your loved ones to move the cans that they used to reach up high for and bring them down on the first and second shelf. Remove anything that you're going to reach up or step up high for, because the chances are you're unlikely to go up and down that successfully every time you do it. And at some point, you're going to have a fall. So we've talked about habits. The first thing you need to do is you need to create habits in your brain of good health. And the second part of living a limitless life is caring for the machinery that you've been gifted. And that means taking care of your back and brain. The origins of this talk came from the hospital asking me to talk about brain health. And the first thing I thought of for brain and spine health is, if we want to nourish our brain and spine, we need to stop insulting it. There are so many things that we do that insult our brain and spine that we'll talk more about. So the second quote I want you to take home, and a book I want you to consider looking and reading is Save Your Aching Back. This is a patient's guide. It's written by a colleague of mine, Stuart Idelson, and it's basically a user's manual for your spine. And I love Stuart's quote in here. He says, in order to save your aching neck and back, you must first understand it. And I'd like to just put in with that, in order to save your aching neck and back and brain, you must first understand it. Because once you understand the beauty of it and the complexity of it, I know you'll take better care of it. So we need to respect and protect and nourish our brain and spine from injury, and we need to treat it well. So let's talk a little bit about the amazing spine that we've been gifted. So first, a little bit of anatomy. You know, the spine is like a 33-story building stacked with floors, which are the vertebral bodies. And each of them serves a certain function. So the ones high up in your neck, the cervical ones, those bones are smaller and they allow for more motion, so you can turn your head and twist and bend. The middle part of your spine, the thoracic vertebrae, they are more built for load bearing, and they're tend to be more rigid. So you can see that they have a different structure to them to allow to bear weight. They're kind of like the flagpole of your body. And then lastly, the lumbar vertebrae for movement, they actually have a little bit of both. They bear weight and they allow for movement. So you can see they're broad, but they also allow for movement, and these joints here allow for sliding back and forth. Then there's the tailbone, the sacrum, and the coccyx, which also contribute to balance. It's important to know the structure of these of the spine so that we can care for it more. Because think of bone as a tissue, just like your skin or muscle, if it's not exercised properly, if it doesn't experience stress, it weakens. And what you see here on the left is an osteoporotic compression fracture. That's where one of the boxes of the bones has collapsed and imploded in on itself. So these fractures can be a significant source of pain, and sometimes they need to be operated on. And what you see over here on your right are two needles that have been placed inside the vertebral body, and a cement has been injected into the bone to fill that fracture and harden it, much like you squirt caulking into a crevice in your bathroom. It will harden and it will eliminate the pain. And that's something that we do in the operating room as spine surgeons. But I tell you what, just like Ben Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's much better to keep your bones strong by exercising it and by feeding them proper nutrients so that this kind of thing doesn't happen. Here, you'll see right here is a cross section of a healthy spine. And I wanted to warn everybody here, we're going to be showing some anatomy specimens of people who have died of spine disease and have died of brain injuries. And some of these images are anatomical pathology specimens. And I don't show them to shock you or to gross you out. I show them in the hopes that we'll learn lessons from these people, that will honor their lives, and we won't repeat some of the mistakes that they've made in their lives, so that we can pass on the gift of knowledge both to ourselves and to our family and friends, so that we can prevent these things from happening. So this is a pathological specimen of a spine that you're looking at, and the reddish honeycombed area are the vertebral bodies. They're the boxes of bone. They're the weight-bearing component of the spine. And these white structures here are the shock absorbers. That's the rubbery cartilaginous space between the bones. It's sandwiched between the bones. And this arrangement allows for the bones to move and bend and twist and turn. These red structures here on the sides, you can see, are muscles that are attaching to the spine. And you can see the delicate balance of the muscles and how they're very symmetric side to side. So this is a healthy spine. And on this side, here's a side view of a healthy spine. You can see the honeycombed box of bone that bears the weight, and the shock absorber here that allows the weight to be dispersed over the edges of the bone. Down here, what you see is a degenerated, severely dehydrated, worn out spine where the disc has completely lost its fluid. You can see that the tissue is yellowish and much more firm, not as rubbery and elastic as the white tissue up here. You can see that there are changes in the bone here, this whitish area. This is scarring. This is hardened bone that's forming in the honeycombing, which is something that comes as a result of the shock absorber not doing its job. Think of the shock absorber in your car. It's not working properly. It's not giving the proper spring. That when your car hits a pothole, that energy is going to be transmitted right to your car, and it's going to damage parts of your car if you don't have a proper shock absorber. So we see these enlarged bone spurs here that can pinch on nerves because they formed as a result of this dysfunctional spine unit. And again, on the side view, we can see the same, the degeneration of that disc shock absorber and some bulging into the spinal canal where there's some compression of the spinal cord. So this is what we want to avoid. How do we avoid it? Well, the spine is balanced think of it as like a circus tent. The middle part of the spine is the post of that tent, and the flaps of the tent and the covering of the tent are all tied down and tamped into the ground equally, and there's a perfect balance there. But if we end up pulling a muscle and not rehabbing it properly, or if we end up using one side of our head more than the other too much, and we don't flex and stretch and do exercises that balance our spine out, those tent poles become cockeyed and one forms a little bit off, and that can form a cascade of degeneration in your spine. So it's truly important for you to stretch your neck and stretch your muscles. It helps with your joint health and allows you to move better. And when you're moving better, the wear and tear on those joints is going to be significantly reduced. So think of yourself as this finely tuned, balanced pulley and lever system that needs stretching and strength of both muscle groups. So you can't just go to the gym and work your biceps. You need to go to the gym and work your biceps and your triceps, the opposing muscle, and you need to stretch your biceps and you need to stretch your triceps to have a fully healthy muscle. Similarly, in your neck, you need to do that. What about ergonomics? That's another way we can minimize the trauma and wear and tear on our spine. It's important for you to have your computer at eye level with a nice, proud posture and some curvature in your spine with maybe a pillow behind your back so that you have a little curvature in your lumbar spine. Similarly, when you're standing, get your shoulders back and your head up. It's much less of a strain on the muscles and bones of your spine if you're balanced in an upright posture. When you're sitting in a posture, when you're standing or sitting in a posture like this, all of the muscles of your back are working overtime to keep your spine up. And that's many times the source of severe back pain. Finally, when you're sleeping, people constantly ask me, what kind of pillow should I use? I got an expensive pillow. It's Tempur-Pedic. It's this, it's that. The fact of the matter is it doesn't matter what pillow you have. It matters how thick and firm it is so that it keeps your head in a neutral position when you're sleeping. Some people ask me, should I sleep on my side or my stomach or my back? It doesn't matter. You can sleep any way you like. Just keep your head in a neutral position. That means if you lay on your back, don't have two pillows that have your head flexed with your chin down. If you sleep on your side and you have broad shoulders, make sure that you have pillows that are firm enough when your head lays on them to keep your head straight, not tilted like you're talking on the phone. Everybody knows when you talk on the phone too long like this, what happens to your neck? You get pain. Well, if you continually do that at night when you sleep, you're going to have wear and tear on your spine that you don't need. So let's talk a little bit about the brain. Important to understand the functions of the brain as we move forward. What you're looking at is the most complex microprocessor in the universe, right here. You have your neocortex or your thinking cap part of your brain, and then you have your brain stem. This is the area of the brain that performs automatic functions. We can see on the underside, we can see the brain is broken into different lobes. This is the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, and we'll talk about their functions. This is the cerebellum, the coordination center. The brain is protected beautifully, naturally, by our scalp, and then our skull, and then the covering that's under the skull called the dura, and then finally under the dura is a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. And that's the space that sits right here where fluid sits between our brain and our skull. And the spinal fluid functions like a Dr. Scholl's padding so that when we do have a fall or we do sustain a concussion, it has some cushion, it has some give to protect the brain from getting that kinetic energy of that force. So we do have some protection there, but we also have to be careful that we don't insult our brain with injuries. So just a Worldman anatomy tour, frontal lobes involved with planning and thinking and future events. Parietal lobe, which is associated with space and time, knowing where our body is in space and time. The occipital lobe associated with vision, and the temporal lobe associated with memory. The cerebellum is our coordination center. And the frontal lobes are primarily composed of gray matter, which I call the thinking cap part of your brain, whereas the white matter are the cables that sit under the gray matter, and they connect all of these cells, different cells together. And that's kind of like your Verizon network. That's where all the crosstalk is happening. That's where your body knows where it is in space and time. So let's do a little exercise so that you can understand how the brain processes information. Everybody read these colors aloud. Okay, now name these colors aloud. A little different. Requires a little thought, doesn't it? Requires some right-left brain discussion. That's what I'm talking about when your brain is processing information. So one of the things that can insult our brain is a concussion, right? This is an MRI study right here of a normal brain, and this over here, this image on the other side, where there's a blackout of those fibers, particularly in the back here, that's a patient with a concussion. So you can see that even though externally a person may look normal, their brain is not functioning normally. Years ago, and I see Coach Fort's on the line there, so I know he used to do this when we would bump our heads in practices. You go, show me how many fingers do I have hold up? How many fingers do I have hold up? Well, that was a good test many years ago, but now we know that that's really not checking the processing of the brain. That's why we're digging deeper and we're looking into recall. We're looking into coordination and balance and testing people. And you can see these elaborate concussion tests that we're performing out the side of sporting events to make sure athletes are safe. And we've done a really good job protecting athletes and keeping them out of competition when they've had a bona fide concussion. Another insult to our brain is if we happen to play sports that have concussive blows to our head. This is a picture of Harrison Martland. This is a doctor who is a pathologist in Newark, New Jersey. And I remember my grandfather telling me stories about Harrison Martland and how he really was the first person to discover dementia pugilistica. What he found was that boxers were in their middle age developing slurred speech. They became very garrulous, very easily irritated. They became non-functional and really just kind of became unraveled in their midlife after their boxing career. And he began looking at specimens, and he was the first person to identify a boxer's brain, which is now described as chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So that's CTE that you see here. So here's a normal cross-section of a brain, looking at it basically as if this person was facing us. And you can see here's the gray matter, the thinking cap on the top, and here's the white matter here, all connectivity, all the wires. And then this is the normal mass of the brain. And then down here you can see how these holes are bigger. These holes are bigger because there's atrophy of the brain tissue. The tissue that was here is now atrophied. It's shrunken, and you can see that there's deeper crevices in the brain here and here compared to up here. And this person has had a chronic injury to the brain and suffered dementia and died from chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And what we see under the microscope are these brown pigments in the neurons called tau. It's a protein that basically conglomerates or congeals on the inside skeleton of cells and stops the cells from being able to transport materials, so then the cells die. And we're learning more and more about CTE, and clearly boxing is an insult to the brain. And I'm going to come out and say boxing is a sport that I think should be abolished now that we know what happens when people box. Football is another topic, a long discussion. Clearly, we can make things safer in football, but we need to be thinking about this if we want to take care of our brains. What are other things we can do to protect our brains? Well, again, remember now, this is an autopsy specimen. This is a patient who passed away from a brain injury, and you can see this space I talked about before. This is the space where the spinal fluid sits. It allows for a cushion. But what happens sometimes when we have a severe blow to the head is a blood vessel will break and will bleed and push on the brain tissue. So what you see here in the middle this red gelatinous area, this is a blood clot that's pushing on the brain that caused this patient to die from an epidural hematoma. This was a skier who skied accidentally into a tree. They were not wearing a helmet. This patient over here was a person riding a bicycle. This is another type of blood clot called a subdural blood clot. This is blood that's under this leathery covering, and this blood clot formed, and this person passed away. They were riding a bicycle without a helmet. Simple, avoidable, preventable things. In this day and age, you know, a helmet when you're skiing or biking is a basic thing. So think about that. And also another point about helmets is don't grow attached to your helmet. Your head changes in size as you get older, as kids grow, and make sure that you're frequently checking it and making sure that you have the right helmet. Oftentimes it'll need to be readjusted. Sometimes you need to switch it out. The foam in these helmets can expire over time. So don't be cheap when you're looking for a helmet for your biking, for your skiing, for any type of activity that might involve a fall. What else can you do to protect your brain? This specimen up here, this autopsy specimen, is a brain abscess. This is an infection, a small pocket of pus inside the brain. And this was a patient that had a dental abscess that wasn't cared for properly. They neglected it. They ended up getting some bacteria in their blood because the infection became significant in their mouth, went into their blood. It ultimately lodged in their blood and then floated up to their brain. Infections in the brain, particularly abscesses, are very irritating to the brain. And this person ended up having seizures that were uncontrolled, and they died of their seizures. This abscess is something that could have been taken out, or even more preventatively, if they had had good dental hygiene, they would have had it. But they passed away because they didn't have a normal checkup with their teeth. The specimen below, this is a patient who didn't get a streptococcal pneumonia vaccine, and this is streptococcal meningitis. So they developed an overwhelming lung infection, which got into their bloodstream and ended up getting into their spinal fluid, and they passed away from spinal meningitis. This is a specimen. This large reddish brownish area is a blood clot in the brain. And this is blood clot that is a result of uncontrolled high blood pressure. This was a patient who was diagnosed with high blood pressure and who had medications for high blood pressure, but they chose not to take them because they said they didn't feel well with them. They didn't like the way they felt. And the specimen over here, this wedge of abnormal brain tissue, this is another patient that had high cholesterol that could have been reversed with medications, because cholesterol fills the blood vessels and doesn't allow the blood to get there. You can see that this is this wedge shape is very typical for this type of a stroke. It's where a blood vessel around here got clogged, and all the brain that it supplied, just like the delta of a river, died out. And this is a person who passed away from complications of their stroke as well. I think a lot of people come to this talk because they want to know how they can prevent Alzheimer's from happening. And we'll talk about that. But one more thing that I wanted to point out is this is a cerebellum of a person who is an alcoholic, and this is a cerebellum of a normal patient over here. So here you can see a healthy cerebellum. This is the coordination center of the brain in the back of the head. And you can see it almost looks like cauliflower. It's got branches of white matter, and it's got these little tufts around it. And you can see here in this patient, they have significant atrophy, shrinkage of their brain cells, and these deeper crevasses, which we call sulci. So you can see that the effects of alcohol. Alcohol in high quantities is a neurotoxin. And so it damages nerve cells and affects our coordination, and can ultimately affect other functions in our body as well. This is a brain of an Alzheimer's disease patient. You can see it's quite different from a normal patient. This normal patient, they have gyri, which are these fat little undulations, and sulci, which are the little crevices between them. And you can see in an Alzheimer's brain, there's significant atrophy of the brain. And you can see these gigantic sulci, and the gyri have shrunken as well. So what do we know about Alzheimer's disease? Well, we know that people with Alzheimer's disease, their brains, when we study them, they have a high level of compounds that are fighting inflammation. They have compounds that are anti-inflammatories in their tissue. And we see that there is an overriding amount of what are called free radicals. These are ions that are like damaging to the brain tissue. They're inflammatory. And think of it almost like as rust. There's like an advanced rusting going on in the brain, because what's happening is these compounds that are irritating and damaging and toxic to the nerve cells are causing dysfunction, and they're causing something called oxidative stress, which is basically the self-destruction of the small cells. And when you lose a certain amount of them, that's when you begin to experience the effects of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So what can we do to prevent it? Well, there's clearly some nutritional advice I can give you, and clearly some lifestyle advice I can give you. So what are those things that we can do? Well, we can clearly monitor our cholesterol and make sure that it's healthy. Remember, low cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, think loser, it's not good. High density cholesterol, HDL, is healthy, H for healthy. We want to, if we're diabetic or borderline diabetic, we want to monitor our blood sugars carefully. And we want to keep an eye on our blood pressure. You can buy a blood pressure cuff now on Amazon, probably for 20 bucks, 30 bucks. It's worth it to check your blood pressure and monitor it. Even just having it in the house and checking it once a week is going to be a step towards better health. What else can you do? Well, we're learning that our gut plays a huge amount of importance in our health. It's a major part of our immune system. Our immune system not only fights off infections, but also can fight off cancerous cells. And the better we can take care of our gut, the better our immune system is going to function, and the better longevity we're going to have. So yogurt is a great food for your gut. Having some of those bacteria that line your gut, that inhabit your gut with a normal, healthy bacteria and probiotics, very healthy. The berries that you can add, blueberries, raspberries, flavonoids, they contain free radical scavengers, chemicals that literally smother those ions that damage the nerve cells. A little bit of red wine. There's some evidence that resveratrol, that's a compound in red wine and also dark chocolate, can also help in free radical scavenger removal. And there's some social aspects of drinking in moderation that actually have proven to help with longevity. We'll talk about that a little bit later. What can we stop eating? Well, we know that the precursors to beta amyloid are trans fats. Trans fats are what we get in our onion rings, in our hamburgers, in our fried chicken. Those kinds of foods, you're literally feeding your body the building blocks of plaques and tangles that come up with Alzheimer's disease. So important for you to understand that you need to keep those foods to a minimum. There's a large amount of evidence that suggests that the Mediterranean diet is really the best way to go. That's a diet that has low meats, typically pork. Also, it has legumes, vegetables, nuts, fruits, high in polyunsaturated fats. This diet has been proven, among many other things, to add to long life. There's another book out there called The Blue Zones by a guy named Dan Buettner, a National Geographic author. And he talks about these 5 zones in the world where you're 10 times more likely to live to 100. And what they found was that these people were eating a Mediterranean diet. That was one of the power 9 that they came up with. The others, and we'll talk about them, were having a good social life, having friends and family, being close to your family, having motion in everything that you do. These places on Earth, Okinawa, Loma Linda, places where people had incorporated some type of exercise with their work, whether they walked to work or whether they had some kind of activity during work. Many of these places didn't have a word for retirement. They basically said, we're going to work in some way, shape, or form for the rest of our lives. So Mediterranean diet, good lifestyle, social lifestyle, all healthy alternatives for longevity. Do supplements help? Yes. There are some supplements that can help with the numbers. Vitamin E is a good one to have. It's another free radical scavenger. Generally, vitamin E is best taken by diet, leafy green vegetables and nuts, better than taking it orally. You have to be careful too, because you can take too much of it. So make sure that is followed by your physician. B complex vitamins help with nerve repair and regeneration. Niagen is a newer one where the research is suggesting it helps with our mitochondria, the powerhouses in our cells. Vitamin D helps with strengthening our bones. We need to take strong bones, healthy bones into old age. Omega-3 fish oils, clearly, again, something that will make our blood a little more lubricated, less likely to have a stroke, and free radical scavengers. And folate also is very good for spine health, particularly in young and middle-aged women. What about fluids? I tell my wrestlers every day, there is nothing better ever than water for your body. There is no electrolyte compound designed that's better than water for your body. Yes, sometimes we can lose some electrolytes, and sometimes some watered down Gatorade or some watered down electrolyte juices are good. But the best hydrating agent is water. Think of it always as your first alternative, and understand that not only you, but our kids and perhaps your grandkids are being advertised every single day by some very powerful and smart companies that are trying to sell them soda that has tremendous amounts of sugar in it and is not good for their health. Exercise. We have numerous studies that show that exercise increases blood flow to the brain. Exercise causes a release of the body's own antidepressants, and it obviously strengthens bone, strengthens your heart, which pumps blood to your brain and keeps your blood vessels more elastic. So this is a study on your left that shows a person at rest, sitting quietly. And this is a heat-related study which shows blood flow to the brain in different areas after a 20-minute walk. So I'm not talking about serious, hardcore, 2-hour in the gym workouts. I'm talking about brisk walking, making exercise a daily part of your life. It's critical. Sleep. We need to think carefully about sleep. It's one of our most neglected nutrients. It's important for your brain to have that sleep time period. It's interesting, your brain doesn't stop working. In fact, it's just as active while you're sleeping as when you're awake, but it's downloading functions, it's pruning things, it's sorting memories, it's processing things that you didn't think of, or subtle ideas and thoughts that you had during the day, and it's disposing of useless information. So it's important for you to know how much sleep you need. Everybody has a different number, but generally it's between 6 to 8 hours of sleep. And you need to get that with good hygiene, which means have a rhythm to it. And most importantly, think of the circadian rhythm. For thousands of years, our bodies have been set up around the sunrise and the sunset. So the more you can do your sleeping in the darkness, and the more you can do your waking in the lightness, the more likely you're poising your body to do what it was supposed to do. So don't fight that. Understand it and work with it. Get that rhythm in your life. So now on to my most enjoyable part of this talk, and that's about the third methodology to come up with a limitless life, to live a limitless life, and that is curating your mind. This is one of my favorite books. It's called The Noticer. One of my youth wrestling coaches gave this to me, and I read it and I drank it up. I loved Andy Andrews, and he's got a number of great books out. And one of the things he talks about in his book is if you take a big breath, and everybody right now, we've gone through a lot of material. We're in the home stretch. We're in the fun part. Take a big breath. Now, what's that proof of? That you're alive. And if you're alive, then the most important part of your life has not happened. And most likely, your life's purpose is not complete. So the stories in this book just will warm your heart. And really what Andy talks about is changing your perspective on life. What does he mean by that? Well, the story's about a man named Jones who basically walks around a town where there's a bunch of people who are off kilter, who really have they've spun off into the wrong direction. And he comes across a young man who's living homeless on the dock, and he befriends this young man. And the young man has had some down times. His parents have passed away. He doesn't have a job. He sometimes will work on the dock cleaning fish or emptying, the boats that come in. But he's really down on himself, and he's down on life. And Jones says, listen, I think you just need to change your perspective. And the young man says, I don't know. So Jones says, I tell you what, how about I treat you to lunch tomorrow? And the young man says, of course, I got my whole day's open. So Jones takes them to the pier, and they walk out on the pier the next day, and he's got a brown bag, and the young boy's excited because he thinks he's going to get a big, nice submarine sandwich or something delicious. And Jones takes out a can of sausages and a little can of sardines. He peels open the sardines and he peels open the sausage, and he hands the jar to the boy, and the young man takes the sausage and the sardines and eats it and says, so what do you think? And the boy says, well, the young man, he says, well, I was hoping for something better. I really thought that, you were going to treat me to something good. And he said, well, what are you eating? What are you doing? And the young man says, well, I'm eating canned sausage and sardines on a pier. And the old man says, yes, you could be eating canned sardines and sausage on a pier, or you could be eating surf and turf with an ocean view. That's what I'm eating. So the premise of the book is, what is your perspective on life? And the story, the most powerful story in this book, is a story about a guy named Norman Borlaug. Now, you probably haven't heard of Norman Borlaug. And I always ask in all of my lectures, does anybody know who Norman Borlaug was? And maybe Gwen, you can look in the chat, but most people don't know. And I'll give you a hint. If you're ever at any of my lectures and I ask you who somebody was, say he was a former wrestler, and you're probably going to be right. Sure enough, Norman Borlaug was a University of Minnesota wrestler. But his real claim to fame was as a botanist in some laboratories in Mexico funded by the United States government. He created a hybrid strain of dwarf wheat and corn that could live in arid climates. He basically came up with wheat that grows in the desert. And his discovery over the last 60 years has been described as a discovery that has saved 2 billion lives. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? But you never know what the actions of one person may have on the impact of somebody else. So, interestingly, Norman Borlaug became interested in botany when he was a kid. Norman Borlaug became interested in botany and was appropriated funds by Mr. Wallace, who was the vice president of the United States at the time. He appropriated funds for Borlaug's research. And he appropriated the funds because he had an amazing interest in botany as well. And he loved botany. And the reason he loved botany because when he was a kid, he began to take walks with a young 19-year-old Iowa State student. And this Iowa State student would kind of babysit him when he was 6 years old and take him on walks and teach him about botany and the power of botany. You know who that 19-year-old Iowa State student was? George Washington Carver. So did Norman Borlaug save 2 billion lives, or did Vice President Wallace save 2 billion lives? Or did George Washington Carver, who instilled the love of botany in Vice President Wallace, save 2,000 lives? You never know what wrinkles, what drops in the pond, what ripples will cause the effects in the future. It's fascinating. One of the things I love about coaching, and again, I'm thrilled to see my coach on, is the impact that you can have on people, the impact that teachers have on people, and the impact that medicine has on people. I love it. And you never know what action you perform, how that will affect somebody's life in the future, and what they will do in the future to change the world. So let's recap our walk of discovery. Remember, what's the magical compound for living a limitless life? Well, first, you need to create new habits and pass them on. You need to care for your back and brain, protect and preserve it. And you need to curate your mind, put in it thoughts of impact, thoughts of purpose and thoughts of meaning, and plan for the future. So remember the quotes. First, we make our habits, and then our habits make us. In order to save your aching neck and back, you must first understand it. And if you are alive, then your life's purpose is not complete. Thank you. And before I finish, I'm going to entertain some questions. So I'm going to hand the microphone back to Gwen, and then I'll finish with a short final exam and follow-up of what happened with Bill and Sandy.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McLaughlin. We do have some questions. The first one that came in is, how about yoga and Pilates for full body stretching?
Outstanding. I have a lot of patients that will do Pilates, and it will actually keep them out of the operating room. Again, it's a combination of strength and stretching, and it's an excellent way to do that. Be careful starting. You need an instructor for that, and you need to start slow with Pilates. Similarly with yoga. There's one position in yoga I'm against, and that's the headstand. Not good for your neck. Your neck was not made to bear weight. But other than that, I'm 100% believer in yoga as well.
Wow. The next question. I'm interested in your perspective on why people do not change their less productive habits to better ones. It seems like there's a negative health impact of obesity or inactivity are crystal clear. Yet a large number of US population remain inactive and obese. What is needed to make the change?
That's a profound question. I think it's like turning a steamship. You're not going to turn it on a dime. It's got to start with very slow, iterative, intentional changes. And I think that that's out there. If you look 50 years ago, my dad was a weightlifter, and he was a weightlifter before anybody thought weightlifting was healthy. And as he went along, it turns out he was an early adopter to a technology and to a exercise, and so I think that the world is getting that exercise is good. We're having more, we have access to more and more opportunities for this. Obviously, interest in sports continues to grow up. I think the key is in getting to the youth, getting them away from the advertisements of, Gatorade bottles and Coca-Cola and things like that, and getting them to understand what are good nutrients for their body, how exercise is a part of daily life. So the future lies in our kids, and that's why youth coaching is so important and teachers are so important in incorporating that. But I think we have the building blocks and the materials to do this in society. I think we're doing it. We could do it faster and we can do it better. And I'm open to ideas.
So we did have someone ask about CTE as it relates to football players, and whether that's what we're seeing in the individuals who have retired and they're experiencing the difficulties now.
Sure. There's no question that CTE is a disease that you are 100 times more likely to get if you are an NFL football player compared to other people that have it. So professional football is clearly a high risk factor. We don't have strong enough evidence that college football is. It's certainly possible. It's on our radar screen. It needs more research. We don't have any evidence that high school football is a cause of CTE. And I'm still a big believer in youth sports. As we just talked about, there's a obesity problem in the United States, and I want kids out on the front lawn playing football. And I believe that football is still, when administered and coached properly, is a safe sport for high schoolers and college athletes. I think it gets a lot more dangerous when you step up to the next level, and those people are professionals and they're making decisions and they're aware of their decisions now. It's a disease we still don't know a lot about. There's clearly some evidence that it may be occurring in our military after mine blast injuries and firing of high velocity rockets. The government is committed, the Department of Defense is committed a large amount of research money towards that. There's some great scientists working on that, and we're making progress. So we need to keep an eye out. We need to be vigilant. We need to ask that question, what are the sports and the risk factors and the activities that can be the cause of it. I would want to assure everyone that, if you or your children have had 1 or 2 or even 3 concussions, I think it's extremely unlikely to get CTE. Yes, a concussion needs to be diagnosed properly and treated properly, but it's still extremely unlikely. It's not something you should be worrying about, other than figuring out what were the causes of the concussion and could it be prevented in the future.
Thank you. What do you consider to be the most important protective measures against Alzheimer's or other dementias?
Number 1, dietary. Important to convert or gradually convert to a Mediterranean diet. Number 2, something called cognitive reserve, which I didn't mention, but it's important to think about. And what cognitive reserve is really your brain is a repository of information. And the more you put in there, the more side channels those nerve cells are going to have to adapt. In other words, if you've got 10 brain cells that learn something and you lose one to a stroke or maybe to a cell that dies, you got 9 others backing it up that might actually come through with what you need to think about. Mm-hmm. There are many autopsy studies that happen where a pathologist will look at a brain grossly and say, oh, there's a lot of atrophy here. I bet this person had Alzheimer's. And in effect, when we look and do the research, the person was highly educated and they didn't demonstrate any sign of Alzheimer's at all. And we find out that they were a lifelong learner. They were somebody who was reading and doing crossword puzzles and learning new things up till the day they died. And so that's what we call cognitive reserve. If you can continually be taking in information, whether it's through reading, whether it's through listening, whether it's through writing or working or learning new skills, your brain is going to have more alternative pathways to function, and you're less likely to exhibit signs of Alzheimer's disease. It's not always possible, but those are two of the best things you can do.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, my next question actually comes from Facebook, and they ask, is there any way to reverse the secondary damage done on the cellular level by TBIs? Or if one has dealt with multiple concussions, is there any way to protect against CTE?
Great question, and sounds like it's coming from one of the medical students or pre-meds. Right now, I know of no research or breakthrough on how to prevent CTE. I know that there's a lot of research going on related to that. The first part of the question was, read the first part of the question again.
Is there any way to reverse the secondary damage done on the cellular level by TBIs?
Yes. So when we talk about secondary injury, so that's when people have a closed head injury, that's the primary injury. And then if they're unconscious, or let's say they're not breathing properly, or their blood pressure is low, and they're in the field, right? That's what we call secondary injury. That's when the brain is vulnerable and it needs blood, it needs oxygen, it needs rest, and it's not getting it. So the sooner we can resuscitate somebody, get them to the hospital, get them into a neuro ICU, the more we can reduce the secondary injury. That's keeping their blood pressure high, not letting them drop their blood pressure, making sure that they are fluid, their IV fluids are appropriate, that their blood is optimized. So there are ways of diminishing secondary injury, and that's with the interventions. Now, in a minor closed head injury, what we're trying to do is give people cognitive rest, try to keep them away from blue light, try to keep them away from deep cognitive thinking. These are hard things to do. What I usually tell people is you can do your daily activities, you just can't do them with a depth and the vigor and the duration that you have before. So you can read, but just read for 15 minutes, take a break, go for a walk, change activities, meditate a little more, get a little rest, schedule a nap. All those things are ways to let your brain recover and reboot from a concussion. Do I have evidence that that's on a cellular level is changing? No, we definitely do in the hospital setting with people with severe head injuries.
Great, thank you. Now you'll have to bear with me. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly. Somebody asked, what about Reuteri, Reuteri? I'm not sure that I understand that. It's L and then a period and Reuteri.
I'm not familiar with that compound.
Okay. We'll come back to that one then if they ask additional questions. The tips that you've provided help with reducing brain atrophy from aging. What do you think of meditation?
I love it. I'm a huge believer. I've probably meditated over 600 times in the last 3 years. I try to do it every day. Some days are tough because I'm called in and I don't get enough sleep and I need to sleep. I prioritize sleep over meditation, but it's part of my morning routine. There are a lot of scientific studies that show meditation increases the cortical thickness of your brain in the areas of your brain that are involved with what we call the awareness centers of your brain, where you can be more comfortable with what's going on. It's called the default mode network. So your brain has a series of networks that it uses at different times, and the default mode network is the sort of intuitive, introspective, open-minded, tolerant part of your brain that you can develop with meditation, and it can strengthen that. So I'm a big believer in it. The app that I love, I highly recommend, is one called 10% Happier. Another great book by Dan Harris, 10% Happier. They have an app. It's the best $100 I've ever spent on the internet, and really, it's packed with a number of beginner meditations, and it takes you on to some advanced stuff. There's great knowledge in the lectures that are there, and I highly recommend it. And again, it's one of those things where if you haven't done it, you got to start slowly. You can't just dive in and sit for 20 minutes and say, I meditated. You got to build that muscle. 1 minute, 2-minute meditation is perfectly fine. Sometimes I just take a 30-second meditation when I'm in the operating room to take a quick break after I've been concentrating for a long time. So good book, 10% Happier. And another good one is Natural Meditation by Dean Slider.
Great. In these days of the pandemic, there has been a greater prevalence of isolation and a reduction in social interaction. What do you think has been the effect on our health, well-being, and perhaps longevity?
Another very thoughtful question, and I appreciate it. It's been good and bad, you know. We're here talking today. I'm looking at a group of people that didn't have to drive anywhere, didn't have to burn any fossil fuels to come to the meeting. I'm looking at old friends who were on the screen, old coaches, people from all over the country. This is remarkable how we've jump-started our technology to become closer. So that's important. The downside is the human touch. People crave that. I crave that as a doctor. I know my patients crave that. That's been a real downside, and something we need to get back to when it's safe, no question. It's not safe now to do that without gloves or protective equipment. Having vaccines is good, but that is absolutely a detrimental part of it. So, like anything, it's the paradox. There's a paradox, and opposites don't negate each other. Opposites abut next to each other, and the interface is where the meaning of life is, really. So we got to take the good with the bad, and we need to make resolutions to be physically closer to people when we can, and do the best we can. And in the meantime, we've got to stay electronically connected, and we need to work on our health individually.
We have another one from Facebook. Do you have any thoughts on potential music interventions for brain aging and Alzheimer's? And they say, great presentation. Thank you.
My pleasure. I will tell you that music is very powerful. It's a very powerful medicine. I've seen patients with advanced Alzheimer's sing songs, lyrics of songs that they knew from their childhood and from their middle age, and it is a way of getting to the brain in a different way. I mean, why do 75,000 people go into a stadium to watch one person or a band play? It's because it's deeply rooted in the deepest parts of our brain. I'm a huge believer in music therapy. Music therapy can come in many forms. First of all, it's the stimulation of old memories with songs and familiar songs. There are some very interesting, well-done scientific studies on synchronizing hemispheres with different sounds, which I've experienced myself, and it can help in concussions and can help in certain brain diseases. And then lastly, I just think it's something that enhances performance. I use music in my operating room. I listen to country music when I'm in the operating room, and I know I got to have my country music for things to go right, and I make sure that it's on when I'm there.
Awesome. So this one is from YouTube. It says, hi, Mark. Thank you so much for this brilliant talk. My mom is 89 and has Alzheimer's. Will taking care of my brain with diet, exercise, intellectual stimulation, and staying social protect me?
Yeah, I'm sorry about your mom. And I know what you're going through because I went through that myself with my family, with my mother. And it's hard. It's hard. Um, yes, the answer to your question is yes. Definitely, what you're doing is correct. Um, Important for your complete body health, which is what you're doing. And keep an eye on the research. There are some genetic studies that can look at certain genetic patterns that can predict an early dementia. I'm going to imagine you probably had that test already. If not, that is available, and you can speak to your neurologist about it. But really, at this point, that's the best thing you can do. Cognitive reserve increase, continue to maintain that curiosity of life, be a lifelong learner, eat healthy, and protect your brain.
And actually, the supplementary question from YouTube was, how much does genetics determine Alzheimer's risk? I think
it's a factor. It's not a major factor, and so there is a certain form that can be checked for genetically, but other than that, that's usually the early onset. But other than that, essentially, you can just take care of yourself and do the best you can.
next question is vitamin B12 best for supplementation? Also, with patients who have fibromyalgia and experience fibro fog, do you recommend the same measure to help their cognitive function?
Well, certainly B complex vitamins are good. All B complex vitamins are good for nerve repair. If we have somebody that has a neuropathy, that's definitely something we want them on. B12 is a good one. However, you want to be careful. You don't want to get too much of that. That can cause a neuropathy. And then the last part I was going to tell you was, I'm sorry, what was, just refresh my memory, what was the question again? B complex, oh, fibromyalgia.
Yes.
Yeah. So fibromyalgia, tough disease to have, tough to treat. The number one thing, in my opinion, to treat fibromyalgia is exercise. And I'm talking about in the form of weightlifting, calisthenics. Those are important things. We do know a lot about exercise. It's probably one of the best painkillers and antidepressants we know. Compared to any medicine, it's probably the best one. So that's a regular exercise regimen. Causes your body to release endorphins and dopamine, and the growth factors that will help prevent the pain that you experience with fibromyalgia. And it's also an antidepressant. It's a potent natural antidepressant. Those would be the two things I would recommend for fibromyalgia, in addition to having a good rheumatology evaluation to make sure there's nothing else going on.
Great. We have time for just a couple more questions. And so the next question is, do you have any data on the brains of vegetarians compared with meat eaters?
I should probably consult my wife on that one. I bet you she knows. I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm going to look that up and I'm going to post it. If I find anything, I'm going to put it on my website because it's a great question. And I really hope that meat eaters are better than vegetarians, but I don't know because I like eating meat.
And we can post that as a follow-up question also on Facebook. So keep your eyes open.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What about patients with Parkinson's? Do you have any specific recommendations?
It's not my area of expertise. I would say that, Parkinson's is primarily a neurotransmitter depletion problem and the death of cells that create dopamine in your body. No question that good nutrition, health, exercise, and stretching, because Parkinsonian patients get rigid muscles, will help. I don't know if the American Neurological Association has any dietary recommendations for Parkinson's. I would bet that it's similar to the Mediterranean diet, but I don't know that answer. And I will make sure we post that as well if there's any good evidence. And it may take me a week or two to sift through the literature to see if there's any good evidence for a Parkinsonian diet that's beneficial. A good question. That's why I love these talks, is I learn too, and I will look that up for you.
Great. And so we'll close out. We just had a note from Jane, who had asked the earlier question about L-reuteri, and I do apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. She shares that it's a probiotic that can be taken as a supplement, and it's naturally found in foods such as aged cheese. It's been mentioned in lectures by doctors on PBS specials, and she just wondered if we had any information on its benefits.
No, thank you for educating us. If it's a probiotic, I'm for it, and I will do some more research on that.
I have one more question here. I think that's everything for this evening. So thank you everyone for joining us. And before we close, I'd like to pass this back to Dr. McLaughlin for our final words.
Great, thank you. Let me just switch back to my screen again for a moment. Of course, like that, it's not advancing. All right, so an update on Bill and Sandy. Well, Bill had his hip surgery, and fortunately the subdural was not operative. It resolved on its own, and fortunately they were able to celebrate their 51st anniversary in Hawaii, and they are staunch advocates for keeping a clear stairwell. The message today really is, you don't have to work in an operating room to save a life. You can do this. Take this information home with you. Share it with your loved ones and your friends. Go to people you know and check their houses out. Take a look around. Look for hazards. Create that new habit. The pursuit is worth it. So there's always going to be someone who will benefit from your choices to make and live a limitless life. The pursuit is well worth it. Here's your final exam. What are you going to do in the next 24 hours that's different? What will you commit to make a difference in your life and others with respect to this talk? I'm going to give you 3 suggestions. If you want to do a low-level commitment, share it with your friends and family. If you want to do a mid-level commitment, buy the books I talked about and read them. They're fantastic. And they're chock full of more information than I could have ever shared with you in this 50 minutes. Or if you really want a high-level commitment, email me. My email is on this right at princetonbrainandspine.com. Email me between the hours of 5 a.m. tomorrow morning and 7 a.m. tomorrow morning. And put in your email your cell phone and what you were inspired by in this talk. And what I'll do is I'll reach out to you when I get a free moment, and I'll help you get started. I'd love to help you. I love helping people and be of service. Thank you for your time tonight. Have a great evening.